Commander Gaius's reputation precedes him, and not in a good way. As the target of widespread opprobrium, Gaius, in my opinion, stands among some of FromSoftware's most unjustly despised bosses. I arrived to Gaius a bit late in my first playthrough, as I was making my first time playing Shadow of the Erdtree simultaneously a no-hit run for this channel, so it took me quite a while to progress. Well before I crossed the threshold into Gaius's arena, I'd heard monstrous tales of appalling hitboxes, bullshit moves, and counterintuitive charge attacks that reputedly made the fight a slog, the worst in the DLC by many accounts. So I was surprised to find my encounter with him entirely unremarkable. I found him one of the easiest remembrance bosses in Shadow of the Erdtree to no-hit, and while I can't say I particularly loved the fight, I certainly didn't hate it. I've refought him many times subsequently, and each time my estimation of him rose little by little, until today I affirmatively appreciate his positive qualities, and would say he's not only overhated, but is in fact a quality boss. And today I'll dive into why I hold this opinion. Let's start with a major point of contention, which just so happens to be the beginning of the fight. Gaius's initial charge attack is definitely a bit awkward and finicky, but this pervasive idea that it's some insuperable abomination just doesn't hold water. The charge attack requires experimentation with roll timing, and in that sense, it demands some patience. But, as I've explained in some of my combat guide videos, if you have strategies for experimentation, it's really not that big a deal. In FromSoft games, when you're dealing with tricky roll timing, if the enemy is in motion, the best strategy is to pick a physical point of reference and determine your inaccuracy relative to that point. For me, I picked the end of his tusk. On my first encounters, I asked myself if I'd rolled too early or too late when I was X or Y distance from the tip of the tusk. This provided a consistent anchor point that allowed me to nail down the timing within something like 3 or 4 tries. So, to me, this objection to Gaius can be dispensed with if you adopt good habits. Another possible cause for consternation is the somewhat boxy geometry of the combination of Gaius and his mount, an issue that I often have with mounted or chunky bosses more broadly in FromSoftware games. Your positioning relative to Gaius can feel unnatural, and auto-locking can push and pull you in irregular or counterintuitive directions and angles. At least, that's how I felt on my first and quite a few subsequent playthroughs. With a much deeper familiarity, however, I actually find this to be the least true of Gaius when you consider him in context of bosses of the same species, such as, for example, Knight's Cavalry or the Putrescent Knight. While positioning after evasion might not work the same way it does with humanoid or non-mounted enemies, in Gaius's fight it's at least highly consistent, which means that once you understand it, you can internalizing it, making natural what was once unnatural. If we examine several of his left side moves, and here I'm referring to my left rather than his, we can see this more closely. More generally, the lock-on forces you into a path of motion that feels a lot more magnetic than it does with non-mounted bosses. But nonetheless, this pathway is much more singular and consistent than it is in fights like Bale or Putrescent Knight, where the camera dynamics or boss motion can be both awkward and unpredictable. You can see that throughout the fight, once you understand the evasive pathways and their angles relative to Gaius's body, you can reliably both evade and counterattack. It doesn't work 100% of the time, sure, and that rigidity of motion will always keep him from being S tier in my book, but with time, I've come to appreciate the ability to maintain a high level of engagement in this fight. But there's more we can say than simply rebutting criticism, and there are aspects of this fight that are actively brilliant to me. Gaius has anti-spamming maneuvers that you can proactively turn to your benefit, both preventing lazy playing while opening an outlet for aggression rather than mere evasion. In my Combat Evolution series, I discussed FromSoft's implementation of anti-spamming maneuvers that prevent players from wailing on a weak point of a boss, and I discussed Godrick's Cyclone Spin as one such example. The spin requires you to disengage to prevent players from overwhelming the boss with relentless attack. I mentioned that this iteration of anti-spam is actually superior to how it was handled in older games, but in some sense, Gaius represents an even further improvement. Godrick requires you to roll away and then roll back in for an attack, but let's look at Gaius. If you get near his hindquarters, he's very liable to do a backward kick that's discharged with great speed and that deals a very harsh damage penalty, a clear indication that the developers do not want him to be a booty boss. But rather than avoid his hindquarters entirely, you can turn this to your advantage. Once you know the timing of his back kicks, you can actively seek out his hindquarters, using the almost inevitable kick as an opportunity to dodge inward and arrive precisely at his head for a devastating counterattack that deals extremely high posture damage. Like most mounted enemies, Gaius has a dominant side from which the bulk of his moveset originates and to which the lock-on strives to coax you. With deliberate effort, you can overcome this magnetism and occasionally move to your right to engage with his non-dominant side. Unlike some fights, Gaius doesn't immediately rebuff these attempts by running away. Instead, his has a much more limited but extremely consistent set of moves, allowing you to plan with a good degree of certainty for attacks and counterattacks. Here, he resembles the Knight's Cavalry more than, for example, Putrescent Knight, whose motions make right-hand engagement quite cumbersome. Gaius also shines for the perfect balance his fight strikes between close range and distant engagement. Gaius does indeed run away from you, but he does so comparatively infrequently. The distance he runs is almost always within the reach of range attacks, and he returns to close quarters engagement quickly enough to prevent the fight from devolving into dreary standing around and stasis. The result is that Gaius presents an excellent opportunity for a mixed fighting style. You can, for example, intermingle melee attacks at close range while spicing up the fight with the arsenal of range incantations and spells at your disposal. Furthermore, Gaius's fight, likewise, is a great platform for showcasing things like the Smith Script weapon class unique to the DLC, which allows you to throw the weapon with an R2 input. By contrast, Putrescent Knight spends quite a while moving around out of range, traveling at an angle that can make the windows for range attacks much narrower. Mesmer also functions best at close range. His disengagement poses a challenge for mixed combat because in Phase 1, there's a great degree of variation in how far he'll travel and how long before he'll initiate a return attack, and in Phase 2, his return attacks comes very, very rapidly to the extent that you really can't use a ton of range because he'll just be back at melee distance very, very quickly. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not ragging on Mesmer. As I've said in my video on him, Mesmer is by far my favorite boss in the DLC, and probably in my top 10 FromSoft bosses across the board. But I do think the tightness of Gaius's range melee distribution pattern is a unique strength that he has. Of course, the fight is not perfect at all, and I mentioned the sort of boxiness and the rigidity of motion as one thing that I just personally don't love in a fight that keeps him out of S tier, but there's a few other things to note. One is that I do think the fight could be strengthened by imparting a more distinct flavor to Phase 2. The intention here is clearly for Phase 2 to feature the adoption of more gravity magic, but the problem is that his use of gravity magic in Phase 2 is wildly variable. In some fights, he uses unique Phase 2 attacks regularly, but in others, like the one here, he hardly uses any, with a good number of them not represented even a single time. Because these attacks are fair and legible, they contribute positively to the fight, and I'd like to have seen them more reliably. There's almost certainly more I could say about Gaius, but these are the elements that stand out to me as most salient as I sit here and reflect upon the fight. What are your thoughts about Gaius? Are there facets worth mentioning that I omitted? Let me know in the comments below, and as always, thank you so much for watching.